thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for the invitation. Is everyone here? Yes. Okay, good. So I'm assuming I have 20 minutes of talking.
Yes.
Okay, so I will try to not waste any of it. So let me start first with the thesis and the way I want to frame my discussion of the very problematic relationships that I find between Protestantism and modernity on one hand, and on the other hand, its effect and influence on Islamic thought, and particularly the Selefi tradition. The way I want to frame it in a nutshell, okay, is around the problem, since I was asked to address the question from the philosophical perspective and the influence of Protestantism and whatever or however that is related to the Salafi discourse on the Islamic sciences, particularly from the philosophical perspective. I want to frame my discussion around a very interesting philosophical problem, which is a relationship between the universal and the particular. And I will start by, first of all, characterizing what I call the paradox of Christianity as far as the relationship between the universal and particular is concerned, how it emerged in early Christendom and early philosophical thinking in Christianity. And then after that, the transformation, very briefly of course, that happens with Protestantism leading to where we are now. Okay? So when I come to that point, I will particularly, from a philosophical perspective again, since I'm not interested in Protestantism per se, but in the way Protestantism manifested itself as a philosophical discourse, I will focus a little bit on Immanuel Kant. And the reason is two things. I mean, first of all, the choice of Immanuel Kant as the ultimate Protestant thinker, I think, is perfectly justified in the history of philosophy. Plus, of course, the influence of Kant. Okay, Kant is in the background of all of the critics and opponents of modernity alike. So it's very important to, I think, to talk about it. Anyway, so to make a long story short, let me first start with the background of the problem. The key issue, as I think many Christian historians will agree with, in Christianity, particularly from a philosophical perspective, is the dominion of the universal, or to use a Hegelian term, the Aufhebung, the superseding of the universal on the particular, or the particular by the universal. And that happens, okay, or is historically related to the problem of incarnation. Okay, so Christ was the universal manifested itself in history. He is God manifested in history. Okay, but that communion in and of itself, okay, assumes that the universal and particular have to always stay separate. In other words, the secular and the sacred have to always be separate. Why? Because otherwise there will be no need for their communion. There will be no need for that moment of Aufhebung, of that supersession. In other words, the paradox is you have a moment in history where the universal overruled the particular through the coming of Christ, through the manifestation of Christ. And then after that, okay, but that moment in and of itself is only justified by an assumption of the radical separation between the universal and the particular, one representing the sacred and other representing the secular or the profane. Okay? And the reason why that distinction has to be made is that it justifies why that supersession happens. Okay? You can find many traces of that in classical Christianity. Okay? The system of the Neoplatonic system of Augustine is very good. But I always find the Aquinas' discussion in the Summa Theologica, particularly in his discussion of laws, okay, the way the eternal law is incarnated in a series of hypostases, if I may put it like that, down to earth in terms of until you get, so we get the eternal law in the mind of God, and after that we move from the eternal law to the natural law. The natural law is manifested or understood in worldly event through the divine law, which is the law of the church, and the human law. Both the human law is the law of the king. These two dimensions, okay, which complement each other to give a version of the natural law, okay, they represent the way in which the absolute should govern history, the way the universal should govern the particularly historical context. Of course, that led to many problems, okay, and that sense of absolutism, in other words. What happened was Protestantism, okay, was not an ending of that. I mean, of course, the idea of the dominance of the church and all of the things that I'm sure you all know from your study of the history of religion. Let alone, of course, the divination of the king and so on. But that when when Protestantism came, what happened was not the end of that moment. What happened was the transformation of that moment. And the transformation happened in a very interesting way, is that relationship between the universal and particular was humanized. So when Luther, for instance, spoke about every human or every ordinary human being becoming, who accepts for the Christian faith, that is the first condition, is a potential priest. Okay? He was trying to say that each one of us have the holy in him. Okay, we haven't yet articulated that holy. Okay, and it has the profane, has that duality, and that duality we can achieve it without the need for the church. But at the same time, and this is a paradoxical element about the Lutheran doctrine and other Protestants, is that he also talked about how fallible we are, because he had to justify the moment of incarnation, and how divine providence needed to come and save us. Okay, so he wanted to establish human freedom, okay, from the institution of the church, which was manifesting the union of the universal, or the communion of the universal and the particular, or the supersession of the particular by the universal. But at the same time, we are forsaken. Okay, and we needed divine providence to interfere in history to save us in a certain way. So what happened is that the ultimate end to this paradox is that the ordinary human, okay, needed, okay, another power to replace that church. Okay, so at the beginning it was the salvation that happened in history, but the more we moved in modernity, or with the progression of the secular, the more there was a need, okay, for something to replace that moment of or that church, that institution, that moment that achieved the ultimate salvation for humanity. What was that? Well, we get a number of answers. Carl Schmitt, for instance, told us politically that the answer to that is essentially the sovereign power. Hence, we get the paradox of sovereignty in the modern state. The modern state represents that, or the modern sovereign, to be frank, to be more specific, represents that power that intervenes in history, okay, and saves the people by suspending the laws. Another one is, of course, the theory of Max Weber about Protestantism, okay, and Protestant ethics, okay, and the idea of the enchantment and disenchantment, the cycle of enchantment and disenchantment that he talks about in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. That is endless with modernity, and that was made possible by the Protestant ethics. On one hand, okay, we are supposed to, that this enchantment relieves us of the burden of religious mythology. So it gives the human agent freedom, okay? But at the same time, because that theological or onto-theological system is taken and completely removed, okay, you are taken into an endless process of consumption and production. So you need a new form, okay, of representing the way in which that representing some telos for your life and action, and representing a moment of salvation again. So what happens is that expert systems and capitalistic notions intervene to replace that and play that role on an economic and social level. Now, let's move to Kant very quickly. So that idea, I find it epistemically and philosophically manifested in the critical system of Kant. So Kant gives us the limits the domain of knowledge to the domain of phenomena. Okay? And he then wants also to place the holy in us. So he gives us the phenomena. The phenomena we have access to through the transcendence of our reason. And the phenomena we have access to through the transcendental use of reason, which is essentially based on the synthesis of intuitions and concepts. Okay? And of course, intuitions and concepts are functioning completely mechanically on their own, just like the world of nature functions completely mechanically on its own. Okay? And then we get the transcendence of reason. But then Kant realizes the problem. How are we going to overcome that duality in ourselves? If I, as a moral agent, okay, who needs the transcendence of reason, as Kant tells us, to justify my morality, okay, on a purely intelligible level, how can I relate those universal claims of reason, which are the basis of my morality, with that mechanical world of nature, okay, that I am trying to relate to and I live in, actually? There is also a deeper problem, is that I cannot be fully satisfied with myself as a moral agent simply because my decisions as a moral agent, according to Kant, happens purely in the domain of intelligibility. It's a purely logical analysis that leads me to a moral decision. However, once that moral decision gets translated into an action, it becomes part of a phenomena, and that phenomena can be interpreted according to the categories of causality and any other category that I use to understand the world of nature. So we get into a problem. And he realizes the paradox, but the paradox continues even in his rational theology. So for instance, in the famous religion within the boundaries of mere reason, he goes and tells us, okay, that Christ is the ultimate example of his humanistic system. But of course, he gets himself again into trouble. Why? Because he himself acknowledged in the beginning of the metaphysics of morals, in the introduction to the doctrine of virtue, okay, that we are both a heilige Wesen, or we have a holy nature, okay, which is essentially established by our reason. Again, the humanization that comes from Luther. The way I'm reducing the cosmological onto theology of Catholicism into the human being, into the subject himself, internally, okay, and a natural reason or a natural essence, okay, which is essentially my empirical ego that is understood mechanically through different sciences. So economics can understand me as a spending and consuming agent. Sociology can understand me in a particular way, and they use the categories, the objective categories of understanding nature, and they apply to me. Okay? So the question is how to relate it to them, and hence he found a humanistic way, or tried to find a humanistic way for resolving that paradox in the critique of judgment, but it fails. I cannot go into why it fails, but this is another story. Okay? But right after Kant, you get really a very interesting moment, which I think we are still living in. And let me quote a very interesting man who actually thinks the same way, namely Foucault, in his most important piece, Les Mots et les Choses, the Order of Things. And he talks about the empirical transcendental blueprint, that radical duality that Kant created. And he says, rightly so, that this was the basis of all, from an epistemological perspective, the basis of the paradox of all modern social sciences. On one hand, the human agent is the basis of all of the categories of knowledge. On the other hand, because the human agent is the basis of all of the categories of knowledge, he becomes the most interesting object of all of these sciences. So at one and the same time, he's the subject and the object. And that is a paradox. Okay? That we are still living in from an epistemological perspective. Okay, so what you get after Kant, and that is will lead me to the Islamic side, is either a radical reduction of the Protestant humanistic transformation of the Christian paradox, okay, to either pure, okay, idealism or pure materialism. Very good example, or one of the very good examples, is Hegel for idealism. So Hegel tried to overcome the duality of Kant in his system of emanationist consciousness, but he ended up reproducing Catholicism in a Protestant version. And as Heidegger brilliantly wrote about him in his most important work, actually I consider the second most important work of Heidegger after Being and Time, the lectures published that he delivered in 1957 under the title Identitäten und Differenz, okay, Identity and Difference, where he essentially characterizes the project of German idealism as a way of re-establishing the ontotheological classical order in terms of a new system of thought, rather than a cosmological naturalism of the scholastic period. Anyways, to jump forward, what you get as a reaction after that radical modernist moment is a materialist reaction to Kant, or to the idealistic reaction to Kant, namely, that couldn't sustain that paradox any longer, and that is postmodernity, which is trying to accept materialism. Okay, and it's no surprise that most postmodernists are very fond of Marx, but of course not the classical Marx, because the classical Marx was just like Hegel. It was a theological thing. They want a defragmented, materially oriented Marx, okay, which is what we find in Badiou and Zizek and company. Okay, so where does Islam stand in relationship to all of that? Well, I'm going to give very few remarks because I know I'm running out of time. So 3 minutes. Wow. Okay, so I'm going. Where I find Islam very interesting, and I heard yesterday very interesting comments, particularly in the first session, about the intersections between Islam and Protestantism. Okay, but I want to qualify that, and I want to be very careful about that. What I find very interesting throughout the history of Islam from early Kalam, and I'm more than happy to elaborate on that in the Q&A period, okay, is an interest in the critique of metaphysics. So it sounds very interesting to us. So you find that in Al-Ghazali's interest in limiting the domain of metaphysics, in the incoherence of the philosophers. Okay, you find it also in Aristotle, in Averroes' critique of Ibn Sina, in the grand commentary on the metaphysics, Al-Tafsir al-Shuruh al-Kubra al-Mabad al-Tabi'ah, and so on and so forth. But it's very different from Protestantism. And the reason is that the human, from the very beginning, the universal and the particular, first of all, the universal is not seen as a sacred. The universal is a medium for understanding the holy. Okay? And the human is, as such, is not seen as either part of the struggle, the cosmological struggle between the universal and the particular, or has that struggle in him, as Protestantism is trying to depict. Rather, the human is standing in between as an interpreter between the universal and the particular. And the struggle is not to become holy. The struggle is to find the best possible interpretation in whatever historical context you are in. That happens in usul al-fiqh through the mind of the faqih, who is trying to bring the usul and the hukm to the historical context. It happens in philosophy. You find it also even in philosophical mysticism, and the best example of this is Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, the relationship between the names, al-asma, okay, and alam al-shihada, which is a constant process of interpretation and reinterpretation. What happened, in 1 minute, I promise, what happened with modernity, okay, and this is why I actually agree to a great extent with the thesis that Professor Tahsin has made yesterday, okay, that Salafism is mostly a political phenomenon, okay, but I think it's an extreme political phenomenon at the very end of the spectrum of the influence on Protestantism that has had on Islamic discourse in general. So if you look, for instance, at early modernists like Muhammad Abdel, for instance, in Company, you will find something very interesting. None of them is actually aware of the Kantian moment, which shares some similarity, but is radically different. And why is it radically different? To keep things clear, because Muslims do not have the concept of the holy. But Kant is similar in the sense that he was interested in critiquing metaphysics. They are not aware of it. Instead, they are aware of the rationalist Hegelian one. Okay? So hence you find people like Abdel and Rashid Rida, okay, consistently expressing, and that actually translated in the early adabiyat of the Muslim Brotherhood, okay, the dissatisfaction with Islamic law and its radical pluralism and how it cannot be put into a consistent absolutist system that is following the constitutional theory of 17th century political philosophy. Okay? You find that very clearly. Okay? When you look at the Salafi moment, you find something actually also very interestingly similar. You find that the Salafis, okay, are trying, the demand, of course there is no interest in the critique of metaphysics, but the interest, the Salafi moment manifests a political crisis of Protestantism as it is dilutedly transformed to the colonial subject of the Muslim world. In what sense? In the sense that the Salafi mentality is always concerned about the material immediate, just like the Lutheran Protestant mentality is always concerned about the material immediate. Okay? And anything metaphysical, philosophical is either denied or postponed till later. Who takes care of it? The sovereign power. Okay? Hence, for instance, okay, you get that strange paradox, okay, where you find people in Salafi discourses fighting about ridiculous things about what you are going to wear and the length of your qamis or jalabiya or whatever they call it, okay, and at the same time they are perfectly fine, okay, with the toppling of the regime in Egypt, for instance, as happened recently in 2013 during the military coup, or that those Saudi kings. So that is the interesting thing, is that it manifested itself in that sense of political adjournment, postponement of the metaphysical questions, okay? Why? Because it is not in that mind, in their mind with that clarity, okay? But because exactly like Luther, okay, who is thinking of the potentially priestly human, okay, being free, but they don't get that far because at the end of the day they are colonial subjects, okay? But at the same time he needs the intervention of providence. He needs God to come into history and give it salvation because he's too weak to do anything on his own. Okay? I will keep the postmodern manifestations to the Q&A answers because I think I have something to say there. I don't want to take any of my time. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, and I'm going to ask you about the early beginning of last century. As you know, it was some sort of beginning of modernity, and I don't see that there is.
What was the beginning of modernity?
Modernity, like last century.
Last century was not, it was the end of modernity.
At least we can say that before this, last century, like 19 or 18, 19, like this, could be like pre-modern and modern. So my question is not related with this difference, but my question is about, we cannot see anybody, not in Turkey or in Egypt, in like any figure, but they are confused almost about everything because they face such a strikingly blow, a cultural and political blow, which is coming from everywhere. And in Turkey, like the audiences are more familiar with like Akif or anybody, you cannot make a distinct decision about them if he is Islamist or nationalist or defending Westernization. So can you tell us a little bit about this new paradigm, starting with modernity and Westernization, and like, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. Then you are asking me about the reactions again to modernity given.
This confusion.
Yeah, oh, so you're asking about the confusion. Okay, well, thank you. I think this confusion is precisely what I was trying to point to at the end of my talk. And the reason for the confusion, as I said, is that first of all, our tradition is not read properly. And I was actually, thank you, because you would allow me to say a remark that I wanted to say, but I couldn't. And the remark is simply the following, is the way in which we are studying nowadays Islamic philosophy, I think is completely, and the rational sciences in general, in the fascinating Muslim tradition, is completely counterproductive, to be frank. Okay, and the reason is, again, that is another issue that is related to that postponement inherent in the Protestant attitude, which has to do with focus on textuality. Because engagement with the text doesn't have an immediate purpose. Remember what I said about the Islamic philosophical attitude, that there is a universal and a particular, and the human agent is constantly in a fight, trying to bring it to the best possible interpretation, and then the notion of tajdeed in Islam. Okay? The notion of tajdeed and ta'weel in Islam. Okay? So that epistemic enthusiasm, that epistemic energy, is completely taken away if you simply study philosophy instead, not philosophically, but rather simply you are reading texts and you are writing about so on, so on, so on, so on. So back to, that is an example of that confusion that I'm talking about. Another example of that confusion is that, as I said towards the end of my talk, is that modernity was transmitted to us in a particular way. Okay? So, for instance, the notion of the critique of metaphysics that I was talking about in Kant, nobody tried to engage it properly and understand in what way we are similar and different. Okay? And it's not enough, for instance, to say that Protestantism gives puts a lot of emphasis on human agency. Okay? Therefore, that is an intersection with Islam. No. It puts an emphasis on the importance of human agency within the paradox of Christianity. So if you are asking me about the confusion, these are examples of the confusion. Now, how to get out of that, that's a long story. Okay? It's to be able to read philosophically the philosophical Islamic discourse and to see where it stands. And to go back to the point where I started, I framed it around the problem of the universal and the particular. So where does Islam stand here? How can it proceed philosophically on this? And how can you bring that very heavy tradition, 14 centuries, to bear on the current questions that are facing us? This is the way to do it.
What's the definition of Salafism, and how do you think they were influenced by the colonialist era? In other words, what are the qualities that they absorbed during the colonialist era? Why they are so friendly to colonialist mind frame?
Okay, thank you. That is a question I'm most afraid of. Okay, so I can tell you in this, I'll actually reduce it to 30 seconds. Salafism to me equals to three things, which I think are all related to Protestantism, but I can tell you that after the talk. Okay? Exorcism, so they are exoteric leaders. Okay? Materialism or material immediacy and the postponement of the metaphysical. Okay? And number three, okay, lack of engagement with present hermeneutics, okay, of proper philosophical engagement with